Hello everyone, welcome back to Sigil. My name is Kevbot, and this is the 5th episode in my series on the history of D&D, one book at a time, where I take an anthropological approach to understanding the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it. In this episode, I'm going to analyze the supplements released for the game throughout the year 1976, Eldritch Wizardry, Gods, Demi-Gods and Heroes, and Swords and Spells, as well as the community reaction to these supplements, and the fight for control over D&D. We will also look at the growth and division of TSR throughout 1976, as it starts hiring more employees from the Twin Cities and Lake Geneva, and the factionalism that develops. We've got a ton of information to cover today, so let's get started. We left off in the last video at the end of 1975. Gary Gygax was able to weather the unexpected death of Don Kay, the other founding partner of TSR, and continue to grow the company while releasing the 2 supplements for Dungeons & Dragons of Greyhawk and Blackmore. Through Gygax's leadership, TSR was not only able to survive, but thrive, and started to expand by the end of 1975 by bringing on Tim Kask, Terry Kuntz, and Dave Arneson as full-time employees. However, this same leadership of Gygax will be tested and brought to its breaking point by the end of 1976, as TSR continues to add new employees, and factionalism within the company begins to manifest. By the end of 1975, Gygax and Bloom had moved the operations of TSR out of the Gygax family basement and into a house on 723 William Street, as Gygax wrote in the October 1975 issue of Owl and Weasel that we have just arranged to purchase an old residence, zoned for business, on a main street here in Lake Geneva. But the residence would require several renovations to be completed before they would be able to open the Dungeon Hobby Shop. In the February issue of the Strategic Review, Kask wrote that we will be partially into our new shop by the time subscribers could read his words. However, the hobby shop would be delayed and officially open in late April 1976. Terry Kuntz, the second full-time employee hired for TSR and employee who did the bulk of the renovations, worked to the till at the Dungeon Hobby Shop while also writing his Robin Hood game. This new base of operations provided sufficient space not only to store printings of TSR's new products, but also space for the growing staff to work. Photos from the April issue of the Strategic Review showed this with photos of Gygax and Bloom working on designs in upstairs offices, while the downstairs hobby shop was filled with copies of Fight in the Skies, Dungeon, Boot Hill, Tractics, and Empire of the Petal Throne, beside walls covered with miniatures from Dirk Kriegspiels. The next 2 employees to join TSR would be Mike Carr and Dave McGarry from the Twin Cities. The April issue of the Strategic Review wrote that TSR has added yet another member to the staff, David McGarry, designer of Dungeon, and that Mike Carr, designer of Fight in the Skies, is due to join TSR in April. Gygax would retain the title of president, with Bloom becoming the secretary and first vice president, while Carr was named second vice president thanks to his experience as a manager of a restaurant.
So Gary offered me the job to come to Lake Geneva, and he said, now that you've had some management training in the restaurant business, which whether that's transferable to gaming, I wouldn't even say it, and Gary said, if you come to work for us at TSR, we'll pay you $110 a week. So almost a 50% pay cut, but the opportunity to do something that you love and not work 6 days a week, that's appealing too. So I jumped at the chance.
McGarry would also take on the role of treasurer and look after TSR's books. While he had no formal training, he did work in the copy center at Harvard Law School and read everything that came through on how to run a successful business.
And I went there to be the treasurer because I seemed to have some sort of business acumen. And Gary was somewhat excited about the fact that somebody's actually going to show up and know how the books are. Not that I had done very much, dealing with banks and things like that, but at least I understood what the practice was supposed to be.
They would each be paid a salary of $10,000. The arrival of his friend from Minnesota must have comforted Arneson, who was struggling to feel at home in Lake Geneva. Arneson complained that the nightlife around Lake Geneva is zero, so that aside from going out drinking, there's playing pinball, and that his forlorn love life took an apparent fatal dive. However, he would hold out hope for returning to Minnesota, hinting in a letter to Richard Snyder that there was a chance that TSR will open a branch office in the cities as early as January of next year. This chance would rely on a gamble at the year-end shareholder meeting, which we will get to later on in the video. Dave Sutherland would also join TSR around this time and work as their first staff artist. Also from the Twin Cities area, Sutherland was introduced to M.A.R. Barker through Mike Menard and did the artwork for Empire of the Petal Throne. He also contributed illustrations to Blackmore and the dungeon scene that would replace Greg Bell's Rearing Rider as the cover illustration for the white box patch press printings of Dungeons and Dragons. The Rearing Rider on the cover of Men in Magic would also be replaced with an illustration from Sutherland, that of an armored foot soldier. Sutherland provides us with an interesting look at TSR's interpersonal dynamics during 1976 with his illustrations in the Strategic Preview, a short-run periodical released during the transition from the Strategic Review to Dragon and Little Wars magazines. In each issue of the Strategic Preview, Sutherland drew an episode of his David McGarry comic series, a parody of the show Mary Hartman. Each member of TSR was represented as a caricature with symbols relating to their gaming history or role at TSR. Gygax would be depicted with a cat of nine tails to motivate the employees, Bloom with his 6-shooters and 50-gallon hat symbolizing work on Boot Hill, Cask wearing a newsboy cap and smoking a pipe to represent his editor role, Carr dressed as an aviator and surrounded by zooming biplanes from his game Fight in the Skies, McGarry with his face buried in the TSR ledgers and hick bubbles representing his drunkenness, Arneson wearing a Blackmore University shirt, and Kuntz dressed as Robin Hood to represent the game he was working on at the time. These 7 employees, along with Sutherland, represented the core of TSR's workforce throughout 1976. It is important to understand the interpersonal relationships of these employees that make up TSR, as it lays the foundation for the growing tension and factionalism throughout 1976 that will reach a boiling point. Not only was Gygax the head of TSR, at 37, he was also the oldest member, with everyone else in their 20s. Gygax was also the only one who was married with children, so combining that with the vast age gap, he tended to lead the company with a sense of paternalism. For the younger employees, though, this came off as authoritarianism. In being from the Twin Cities and outsiders to Lake Geneva, the 4 of McGarry, Carr, Sutherland, and Arneson banded together in a coalition of sorts against the core of Gygax, Bloom, and Cask. Arneson and McGarry would share an apartment together, with Carr and Sutherland also rooming together, and the 4 of them would spend their evenings together at the corner bar on the first floor of the Hotel Claire. While tension started to grow within TSR, there's also a growing tension between TSR itself and the fan community that exploded since the release of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974. The game ends with a call to action to the community. Write to us and tell us about your additions, ideas, and what have you. And the community would respond in turn. Gygax wrote in the Strategic Review that heaps of material have been received, and we do plan to publish most of it, but it would soon become clear that TSR could not publish all of the overwhelming amount of material that was sent to them, even if they wanted to. This would create a tense relationship between TSR and the D&D player base, attempting to toe the line between maintaining control of the game and keeping the community engaged. Gygax would acknowledge and address this problem in the next issue of the Strategic Review by asking the community what kinds of material they wanted TSR to publish in future supplements. We get stacks of stuff every week from players, and a good deal of it is quite good. Well, it is impossible to print every bit of it in Strategic Review. We just don't have the space. And we certainly don't want to discourage future submissions. So we thought that we would select the best material received and print it along with the items printed in Strategic Review as a supplement. How about a supplement of nothing but magic? Or how about a book of artifacts and relics? As TSR could not publish every idea that was sent to them, community publications such as Alarms and Excursions proved invaluable to disseminate these ideas. TSR even recognized this, writing in the Strategic Review that Alarms and Excursions is far and away the best D&D zine. Alarms and Excursions would also serve a secondary purpose that the Strategic Review was unable to, by engaging the community in a dialogue. Ideas submitted in one issue could be responded to, critiqued, and built on through comments submitted in the next issue, and so forth. Therefore, whereas the Strategic Review marketed itself as somewhat of a final authority on the canonicity for fan-submitted content to the game, Alarms and Excursions took the opposite approach and published everything that was sent in, no matter the perceived quality, to be refined over time through the community itself. But what legitimate authority could TSR claim over determining the canonical rules for the game through the Strategic Review? As an example, let's look at the Bard class. The Bard class was written by Doug Shrugman and first published by TSR in the February 1976 issue of the Strategic Review. However, variations of this class had been published all the way back as early as the first issue of Alarms and Excursions, which we briefly touched on in the last episode, with Mike Seaman submitting his proposal for a character type of singer or bard who also sings spells and would be permitted to operate during a given adventure as a fighter, cleric, or magic user. In typical fashion for submissions to Alarms and Excursions, Seaman wrote, "All helpful suggestions greatly accepted. And Lee Gold immediately replied, "I strongly object to introducing any new characteristics," referring to the inspiration stat that Siemens suggested as the prime requisite for the class. This is not meant to suggest that Schwegman plagiarized the class from Seaman, but the question is whether Schwegman's Bard has a stronger claim to the canonicity of D&D than Siemens due to its publication in Strategic Review by TSR. Does the publication by TSR a year later signify with any level of authority the class into the official rules of D&D? While most readers and contributors to Alarms and Excursions would refute this point, it is notable that the Bard class has remained with the game ever since, whereas other classes that only receive publication in Alarms and Excursions, such as the Courtesan, Mad Scientist, or Ninja, have not. However, whether they liked it or not, the rules they published would still end up being subjected to the same scrutiny and critiques in the pages of Alarms and Excursions, which we've already seen with the response to and counter proposals of the Monk and Assassin classes from the Blackmore Supplement by Greg Kostikin. The tension between Gygax and the growing D&D community can be seen in two articles written by Gygax in the April 1976 issue of the Strategic Review, The Dungeons & Dragons Magic System, and D&D is only as good as the DM. The first article is a reaction to those gamers who rejected his Vantian spell memorization system, such as Lee Gold's spell point system we looked at in the last video. Gygax starts by explaining that the intention of how spellcasting should work was poorly explained in the original game, and describes the intended Vancian system of spell memorization with verbal, somatic, mental, and material components all required to cast most spells. He says that this system was specifically and carefully chosen, however, in practice it did not work out as planned. Primarily at fault is the game itself, which does not carefully explain the reasoning behind the magic system, and so many dungeon masters ran spellcasting with a different interpretation, where spells and spell scrolls could be cast an infinite amount of times. This would lead many dungeon masters to gear their campaigns to the level of TV giveaway shows known as the Monty Hall DM, with gold pouring into players' purses like water, and magic rewards strapped to the back of lowly rats. And when the spellcasting system as intended was finally explained by Gygax, many dungeon masters and players balked. They enjoyed the comic book characters, incredible spells, and stratospheric levels of their way of playing. And so this leads to Gygax's conclusion. D&D is a free-form game system, and was designed with a great variation between campaigns to be allowed. But there are some variations which are so far removed from the original framework as to be totally irreconcilable with D&D. These have become games of other sorts. In essence, Gygax is putting his authorial stamp on what is and is not D&D. Gygax ends the article mentioning that spells above the 10th level will not be published by TSR, as the creation of an endless number of more powerful spells is not desirable in the existing game system. And if character level progression is geared to the game system, it should take years for any magic user to attain a level where the use of 9th level spells is possible. This clarification again seems to contradict the rules as written in the original game, which allows for endless level progression above the written levels, an interpretation taken liberally by the Caltech players. Gygax would expand this criticism and clarification with the second article, D&D is only as good as the DM. He starts the article by saying that successful play of D&D is a blend of desire, skill, and luck, and then criticizes dungeon masters who break this by turning his dungeons into a veritable gift shop of magical goodies, ripe for plucking by players. Outdoor expeditions become trips to the welfare department for heaps of loot. Monsters exist for the slaying of the adventurers. Experience points are heaped upon the undeserved heads of players, levels accumulate like dead leaves in autumn. For Gygax, this creates two issues, as if players with standings in the 20s, 30s, and 40s of levels do not become bored, they typically become filled with an entirely false sense of accomplishment. They are puffed up with hubris, as they have not really earned their standings, and their actual ability has no reflection on the campaign level. Gygax says that no player in either Blackmore or Greyhawk has risen above the 14th level, and specifically calls out Caltech players in this regard. Now I know of the games played at Caltech where the rules have been expanded and changed to reflect incredibly high levels, comic book characters and spells, and so on. While D&D is pretty flexible, that sort of thing stretches it too far, and the boys out there are playing something entirely different. Perhaps their own name, Dungeons and Beavers, tells it best. Again, Gygax ends by putting this authorial stamp on the intention for the game, stating different strokes for different folks, but that is not D&D. The broader gaming community would respond to these criticisms with a sense of anti-authoritarianism and scrutiny towards the way that Gygax ran his games, and TSR's claims towards authorial intent over what is and is not D&D. Much of what Gygax wrote was seen as hypocritical and contradicted his letter in Alarms and Excursions 2, where he insists, I desire variance in interpretation, and I will do my utmost to see that there is as little trend toward standardization as possible. In Alarms and Excursions 13, Scott Rosenberg wrote, Gygax's letter to A&E 2 provides a biting counterpoint to Gygax's articles in SR. If everyone can play his own way, why is Gygax telling people that that's the way to play in SR's pages? Bill Maxwell Jr. wrote an article called A Creative Look at D&D/EPT, or Gary Gygax is Not a God, where he says, remember, you are the moderator, not E. Gary Gygax. Don't feel urged on or inhibited by his many creatures and rules. If you don't like his combat system, don't use it. If you think that the rules for assassins and monks are worthless, by all means change them or skip them. Gary Gygax may be a good moderator as far as moderators go, but he isn't a good fantasy game designer. In the last episode, we looked at Mark Swanson's criticism of Gygax running Tomb of Horrors during the Origins 1 tournament, and what he believed to be Gygax's intent for how the game should be run, an impersonal death trap. Whether this is an accurate interpretation or not, it couldn't have been helped by the aforementioned article where Gygax writes, if a favorable player stupidly puts himself into a situation where he's about to be killed, let the dice tell the story and kill him. In Alarms and Excursions 11, Nikolai Shapiro writes, as for me, I'll never play Gygax's D&D. So Gary, you can fume and fuss to your heart's content, and call me all sorts of bad names for playing a game that is not D&D, but instead some horrible twisted variant, but that's the real world, buddy. Summarizing these feelings in a uniquely D&D way, Alarms and Excursions 15 has a proposal for the Gygax monster, a bullheaded man who will insist upon everything being done their way, although they will insist that they favor individuality and diversity. While this animosity was growing between TSR and the gaming community, things were made worse by TSR simultaneously using legal channels to protect their trademark of Dungeons & Dragons. The first of these battlefields being with the publication of character sheets. The original game did not come with any form of a character sheet, and the community realized the need for some means to track various abilities, equipment, and character progression between games. Most of these character sheets were published in fanzines and appas, such as in the first issue of the Haven Herald, designed by Stephen Tihor, and in issue 2 of Alarms and Excursions, designed by Jack Harness. In issue 5 of Alarms and Excursions, Dick Eney created one on the basis of Harness's, Gold Johnstone, and Tihor character sheets. Another sheet by Jeff May was published in issue 12 of Alarms and Excursions, and Hartley Patterson printed his own in issue 16 of News from Bree. Robert E. Rupert created a set of character sheets customized for each class of D&D that appeared in the January 1976 issue of American Wargamer that included areas for local variations of the game, such as Swanson's special abilities from the first issue of Alarms and Excursions. Rupert's sheets printed Dungeons & Dragons character sheet along the top and would sell them for 2 cents for a sheet or 8 for 15 cents. When Rupert contacted TSR in January 1976 to see if they would be interested in publishing his sheets, they responded with a cease and desist letter from their hired law firm, Allen & Lennon. A letter from David A. Lennon to Rupert, dated March 5, 1976, insisted that Rupert cease any publication of any such work based on the game Dungeons & Dragons, on the grounds that the game Dungeons & Dragons and the title of that game are copyright of TSR Inc., a Wisconsin corporation, and were filed in January of 1974. Therefore, any continued use by you would be a breach of this copyright and would subject you to further legal proceedings. They are the exclusive agent for producing and manufacturing any games or associated items for use in the game of Dungeons & Dragons. It is unclear whether the use of copyright here, instead of trademark, was simply an oversight or an intentional assertion. The letter affirmed that no one could publish any games or associated items for use in the game other than TSR, and would appreciate it if you would cease producing this character sheet and any other similar products at once. Shocked at this response, Rupert reached out to Tim Kask, who clarified in a letter dated March 13th that it was the use of Dungeons & Dragons that upset us. While character sheets before Rupert's contained many elements from D&D, like hit points and levels, they did not print the name Dungeons & Dragons itself. This is similar to the other cease and desist letter sent by TSR to Flying Buffalo, who used the words Dungeons & Dragons in their advertisements for their game Tunnels & Trolls when comparing the two games, and to metagaming concepts for publication of these advertisements. The June 1976 Space Gamer reported that TSR Hobbies Inc. recently moved to defend what it considered to be an infringement on the copyright of their game Dungeons & Dragons. In a letter from TSR's lawyers to Rick Loomis of Flying Buffalo Inc., advertisements for FBI's game Tunnels & Trolls were cited as infringing copyright by mentioning that TNT was like D&D. A copy of the letter was also forwarded to Metagaming Concepts, also considered to have violated the D&D copyright in ads for Tunnels and Trolls. Possibly more aware of the difference between a copyright and a trademark, the article continues that D&D copyright was not violated in the case of advertisements. He would concede that D&D would not be mentioned in future ads out of respect for a good working relationship with TSR, and that it was regretful that expensive legal advice was thought necessary for a matter easily able to be handled by an informal letter. To circumvent this in the future advertisements, companies like Flying Buffaloes and Metagaming Concepts would begin to market their games using the term role-playing game, which started the process in cementing this term as an entirely new genre of game. Rupert offered to sell his character sheets to TSR, but Cask replied that he was too late, as they had already started selling the character Archaic. The character Archaic was a third-party character sheet created by Pete and Judy Karsten and illustrated by Brad Shenik. First advertised in the February issue of the Strategic Review, it contained various character sheets, 8 for mages, 3 for clerics, and 16 for fighting men of different races. Along with character sheets, it also included a single-page map of a 24-room dungeon called the Wizard's Tomb, a creature encounters chart, and various other forms. It was sold for $3, a new revenue source for TSR, and a far cry from the selling price of Rupert's character sheets at 2 cents. Gamers criticized the price, with for instance Scott Rosenberg in issue 2 of Cosmic Balance saying its level of development is back at our first generation sheet, we're now on our 5th or 6th. What a waste of money. Another issue was the generality of the sheets, as they were designed to be used with either Dungeons & Dragons or Empire of the Petal Throne. For instance, it contained areas for all 8 abilities, the 4 that both games shared of Strength, Intelligence, Constitution, Dexterity, along with Wisdom and Charisma for D&D, and Comeliness and Psychic ability for Petal Throne. This would lead to confusion for gamers who weren't aware of both game systems and their differences. The tension between TSR and the broader gaming community highlighted questions on who controlled what Dungeons & Dragons is from both a creative and a legal perspective. As the cease and desist letter from Alan and Lennon wrote, the game Dungeons & Dragons and the title of that game are copyright of TSR. But by 1976, what was Dungeons & Dragons? Obviously, this would be the 3 original booklets, but what about the content printed in the Strategic Review? Would that be considered D&D, due to it being published by TSR? The Strategic Review would print fan-submitted material. Would this now also be considered D&D from a legal perspective? What about variants on official classes published by the community in fanzines, such as the Revised Monk and Assassin subclasses? Did these variants infringe on TSR's rights? What about classes like the Thief or Bard that were published earlier than the TSR version? Or games like Tunnels and Trolls? How similar or different do game systems need to be before it's no longer considered the game Dungeons & Dragons? Whether it was about spellcasting systems, new classes, level limits, or publishing entirely new game systems, the tension between creative and legal control over what exactly Dungeons & Dragons is was just beginning. TSR would release the 3rd supplement for Dungeons & Dragons, Eldritch Wizardry, on May 1st, 1976. As stated in the Strategic Review, it would present psionic powers, abilities in combat, druids, a new class of clerics, artifacts and relics, new outdoor encounter tables, and new monsters, demons and psionic. The supplement is credited to Gygax and Bloom, with special thanks to Elder Steve Marsh, Dennis Suster, the Great Druid, Jim Ward, and Tim Kask for their suggestions and contributions. Although many ideas adopted in Eldritch Wizardry were contributed by the larger D&D community, there is a lack of any acknowledgement towards that in the credits. Illustrations were credited to Dave Sutherland, Tracy Lesh, and Gary Quaspitz, with the cover illustration printed in full color done by Deborah Larson. The cover illustration depicts a naked woman on a sacrificial altar, bearing a close resemblance to the cover of A. Merritt's Dwellers in the Mirage. Lesh provided only a single illustration for Eldritch Wizardry, the iconic Death Heads, that depicts a lich performing a ceremony, and noted as his favorite illustration that he did for TSR. Quapsitz only submitted one art piece, his way to represent an in-game scenario, inspired by his love of comics and telling stories with pictures. The rest of the interior art was completed solely by Dave Sutherland. Eldritch Wizardry introduces psionic abilities into D&D, which are mental powers in human characters that allow non-spellcasting characters some spell-like abilities. The introduction of psionics into Eldritch Wizardry demonstrates the interplay between TSR and the fan community that we looked at earlier. As far back as February of 1975, Gygax wrote in a letter to Alan Lucian that he planned in a later supplement I will include mystics and divines who will use magic and mental powers, and there will be a system for mental combat as well. And when Gygax ran the Tomb of Horrors at Origins in 1975, a tomb design that was adapted from Lucian, there is a reference at the end that to defeat the Demi-Lich of Sararak, the highest divine destroys it by touch, and a mystic can destroy it by mind battle. Mental power rating of the skull is 18. The Mystic class itself began as a proposal that Steve Marsh sent to Gygax, as Marsh would clarify in Alarmist Excursions that the Mystic is what eventually became the Psi powers part of Eldritch Wizardry. However, this would only be part of the idea that went into psionics in Eldritch Wizardry, as Marsh clarifies that there's no mention of psychic attack defense in conjunction with this class, as that practically belongs to Gary Gygax's Divine class and had nothing to do with the Mystics as they were developed. Gygax planned to call these powers psionics and introduce them in 3 new classes, saying the supplement after Blackmore, by me, will get into psionics pretty thoroughly with 3 classes, which will use mental powers to some extent. While Marsh was experimenting with a psychic class, and even Dave Arneson initially proposed a class of mentalists in his outline for the Blackmore supplement, in the end, all of these ideas will be combined and introduced in Eldritch Wizardry, not through new classes, but through special abilities open to any class. The introduction of the new Druid class is also an example of this interplay between TSR and the fan community. After first being introduced the year prior in the Greyhawk supplement as a new monster, Jack Harness wrote the rules for a neutral cleric class, based on the Druid in Greyhawk. And just a month before Eldritch Wizardry was published, Hendrik Pfeiffer would also publish another Druid system, this one being the subclass of magic users instead of clerics. While it's almost certain that TSR would have read both of these ideas for the Druid class, the one published in Eldritch Wizardry is credited to Dennis Suster, the Great Druid. Suster played with Gary Gerke, who wrote to Gygax even before publication of Greyhawk that the group had developed the idea for a druid, a sort of cleric who is more attuned to nature and fire. They have their own levels and spells, and are very useful in wilderness, and to some extent castle adventures. This druid system would also introduce several new druid-specific spells for the class, such as Speak with Animals, Call Lightning, and Transport via Plants. One difficulty for TSR and Dungeon Masters when new products were released, such as Blackmore's Temple of the Frog, is that there's nothing stopping players from buying these products to read and learn secret information for the Dungeon Master's eyes only. As Cask writes in the introduction to Eldritch Wizardry, D&D began to become predictable as a result of the proliferation of rule sets. When all the players had all the rules in front of them, it became next to impossible to beguile them into danger or mischief. So, the new concept pioneered within these pages should go a long way towards putting back in some of the mystery, uncertainty, and danger that makes D&D the unparalleled challenge it was meant to be. To achieve this, the section on artifacts includes 5 tables for the Dungeon Master to roll on to randomly determine the properties of each magic item. This would make it impossible for players to read Eldritch Wizardry and know exactly what these artifacts do. Of course, this presumed that Dungeon Masters were either unable or unwilling to create their own monsters and magic items, something that was heavily discredited already by the deluge of publications and fanzines even by 1976. In any event, Eldritch Wizardry is notable for the introduction of several artifacts that would become classics in D&D lore over the next 50 years. The Hand and Eye of Vecna, Sword of Cass, Rod of 7 Parts, and Wand of Orcus, to name a few. Speaking of Orcus, Eldritch Wizardry would also depict various demons from ancient and contemporary mythological sources, such as Orcus and Demogorgon. Dave Sutherland would do the art for these portraits under direct guidance from Gygax. The reception of Eldritch Wizardry was generally positive. In Space Gamer, Glenn Taylor wrote a review that goes into great detail covering everything in the supplement, concluding his review by saying, "All in all, Eldritch Wizardry is well worth the admittedly high price of $5. It is as good as Greyhawk, and that's saying a lot. It should put the spice of danger and unpredictability back into D&D, and partially satiate that hunger for new material that typifies D&D enthusiasts everywhere." Taylor's only real criticism is regarding the modified combat system, although it is a soft one, saying each melee round is divided into 6 movement segments and a pre- and post-movement segment. Some may find these stages too cumbersome, but I find them to be much more logical than simply rolling a die to see which side gets to strike first. The cover of Owl and Weasel 16 contains a glowing review of Eldritch Wizardry, mainly focusing on the new psionic powers and monsters with psionic abilities. While the review concludes that there's no doubt about it, Eldritch Wizardry is an excellent supplement that puts the odds back in the favor of the Dungeon Master, there is one soft criticism regarding the new psionic rules, saying with the introduction of psionic ability, the game is going to become even more complicated and technical, with the result that there will be an even bigger gap between ranked novices and experienced Dungeon Masters. In Alarms and Excursions, Nick Smith wrote, "The more I consider Eldritch Wizardry, the more I like it. It's a goldmine of ideas that have long been needed. The lack of demons has also been a major shortcoming of D&D since its beginning, and the artifact tables are great for cranking up your own special items." However, in the same issue, Wayne Shaw criticizes the psionics as reading like a badly edited first draft of a good idea, and that the artifacts are okay, but I'm more impressed with the powers tables. A month after the release of Eldritch Wizardry, TSR published the first issue of their new publication to replace the Strategic Review, called The Dragon. Cask would announce this change in the final issue of the Strategic Review by saying that they have formed another division of TSR Hobbies Inc., TSR Periodicals, and that TSR Periodicals will produce 2 magazines, one devoted to swords and sorcery, fantasy, sci-fi, and role-playing games, which would be called The Dragon, and the other to deal with the established types and periods of wargaming, which would be called Little Wars. These 2 magazines would mirror the growing divide between gamers who prefer traditional miniature wargames and those interested in the new genre of gaming being coined as role-playing games. By this time in 1976, the term role-playing games was starting to enter into the gaming lexicon for 2 reasons that we looked at earlier. It would be a way to compare games such as Tunnels and Trolls to D&D in advertisements without using the trademark Dungeons and Dragons and being threatened by legal action from TSR, and also to describe any game that shared fundamental characteristics with Dungeons and Dragons, but enough modifications that Gygax would deem it not D&D, such as the gamers at Caltech. Gygax and Bloom made the decision as far back as February 22nd to create a new division of the corporation for the purpose of publishing one or more professional journals, which would begin by transforming the current house publication, the Strategic Review, into a publication of non-house nature, which would survey the entire industry impartially. However, gaining the reputation of independence and impartiality from TSR would be a challenge for the Dragon. To help with establishing the sense of impartiality and distance itself from TSR, the first issue of the Dragon would focus on including a variety of different games and voices. While there are articles about D&D and Dungeon, there are also articles on games such as the Battle of the Five Armies and Royal Armies of the Hyborian Age. While there are reviews of TSR miniature games like Classic Warfare, there are also reviews for Fantasy Games Unlimited Citadel and Chaosium's White Bear and Red Moon. And while there are articles written by TSR employees like Gary Gygax and Tim Kask, there are also articles written by Lee Gold and James Ward. There's even a promotion at the end of Gold's article saying Alarms and Excursions is highly recommended for D&Ders everywhere. The cover of the first issue of The Dragon was done by Bill Hannon, Tim Kask's junior college art instructor. Along with printing articles, advertisements, and new rules for game systems, The Dragon would also publish sword and sorcery fiction, the same type of fiction that Gygax read in his childhood that would inspire his interest in fantasy miniature gaming. This would introduce new fantasy fiction, such as Gardner F. Fox's stories in issues 2 and 5 of The Dragon, as well as reprinting stories that were long out of print, such as in issue 11 of The Dragon, where Kask writes, "We have reached an agreement with Elsbrog de Camp to reprint the missing Harold Chase story from the Incomplete Enchanter series, The Green Magician." While Gygax may have been influenced by the fantasy fiction stories in a way that led to the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, in a circular fashion, Dungeons and Dragons would now inspire future authors to write stories within the genre, something that will become financially important to TSR in a few years with the Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms series of books. An early example of this would come in issue 12 of The Dragon from author Andre Norton, who debuted part of her new novel Quag Keep. Written after Norton played a game of Dungeons and Dragons with Gary Gygax, it was the first novel to be set in Gygax's world of Greyhawk, and the first to be based on the game of D&D. In the novel, the protagonist Martin is playing a game of D&D when he touches the miniature and is transported into the world of Greyhawk. The Dragon would not only publish established authors, as in the first issue, there is a story from the unknown author Garrison Ernst, titled The Gnome Cache, that takes place on the fantasy world of Earth. It is fairly obvious to see that this Garrison Ernst is in reality Gary Gygax, who always had ambitions on becoming a fantasy writer himself, and was writing about the world of Greyhawk. Future installments of The Gnome Cache would follow the main character of Dunstan exploring the world of Greyhawk, allowing Gygax an opportunity to expand the world to the level of Barker's Techumel. One can imagine how excited Gygax would have been to have his fiction writing published alongside fantasy authors that he admired growing up, such as Fritz Lieber, whose writing can be seen in the first issue of The Dragon, promoting his game of Blankmar through his characters of Fafard and the Grey Mouser. Beyond releasing Eldritch Wizardry and The Dragon, the one event from the summer of 1976 that would have the largest impact on TSR years later is the TSR stock option. On July 30th, Gygax and Bloom created twin options to buy 700 shares of TSR stock at $100 each. Doing this encourages executives in a corporation to increase shareholder value, as it locks in the price for the stocks that can be later purchased. For instance, if in the future stocks of TSR were worth $1,000 each, Gygax and Bloom could exercise this option and purchase stocks at $100 each, profiting $900 per stock. Exercising these options in 1976 would be impractical for either of them, as TSR stock was only worth about $110 each, and doing so would cost $70,000. There's also no hurry to exercise these stock options, as they would not expire until 1986. However, in just a few years, TSR stock would become much more valuable than $110, and control of TSR would become control of a small gaming empire. So for now, these twin options sat in the TSR files, waiting, and would go off in 1985 with a dramatic impact on TSR and all involved. As with 1975, the summer of 1976 would see the two competing gaming conventions of Origins 2 and Gen Con 9. Origins 2 would be held again in Baltimore from July 23rd to 25th at Johns Hopkins University and be run by Avalon Hill. This year would be even larger than last, with attendance rising to roughly 2,500. TSR would drive 9 of their employees to Baltimore for the convention, as illustrated by Dave Sutherland in issue 5 of the Strategic Preview, where we see, from left to right, Mike Carr, Tim Kask, Brian Bloom, Ernie Gygax, and Terry Kuntz carrying Gary Gygax in his desk with his cat of nine tails and finger over the panic button, Dave Arneson, Rob Kuntz, and Neil Topolnicki. Dave McGarry would stay behind to watch over the dungeon hobby shop, saying bye guys from the house on 723 William Street. Like when he ran Tomb of Horrors the year prior at Origins 1, Gygax would again run a demonstration of D&D and a tournament at Origins 2. As promoted in the Avalon Hill General, each trip through the dungeon will accommodate a group of 12 adventurers in 4-hour rounds. The top survivors in each round will receive a credit slips for TSR products. A demonstration game of D&D will be held Friday evening and hosted by Gary Gygax himself to introduce new people into the fantasy scene. Players may enter only one dungeon trip, $1 entry fee. However, given the overwhelming amount of gamers who registered to play, TSR ran 5 trips simultaneously in each time slot for a total of 240 players. Glenn Blackow wrote about his experience at Origins 2 in issue 15 of Alarms and Excursions, saying that he was unable to enter the tournament as he did not pre-register, but he was just as glad. A buried spaceship type of thing, all very technological. Black. From this description, it's clear that Gygax ran Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, complete with the subterranean remains of a long-defunct colony ship overrun by mutants and technological gadgets. This would fuel rumors that TSR was working on a science fiction-themed game similar to D&D. Participation in the D&D tournament exceeded any other tournament at the convention. For the beginner demonstration game, Gygax would introduce gamers to the first level of the Greyhawk dungeon, and the General reported that Gygax ran it before standing room only crowd, further showing the growing interest in D&D. Comparing the growth of D&D between the two Origins conventions, and with the game being the largest tournament at Origins 2, Avalon Hill no doubtedly would have taken note of this. Initially dismissive of Dungeons & Dragons, they would no longer be able to deny this growing market, and would start to try to capitalize on it. They would release a board game adaptation of Robert Heinlein's novel Starship Trooper, prompting cast to write in the second issue of The Dragon that even the big two of gaming, Avalon Hill and SPI, have come around to the view that fantasy gaming is here to stay. This change in attitude is evidenced by the fact that both of them have produced fantasy games. Avalon Hill would also rapidly adopt the term of role-playing game, writing in the July issue of The General about a new title called Gunfighter, an individual role-playing game of life and adventure in an Old West cowtown, and Comanche, another role-playing game from the Old West. Following Origins 2, about 4 weeks later on August 20th, TSR would host the 9th Gen Con, held this time at the Lake Geneva Horticultural Hall and American Legion Hall for more gaming space. However, even though it had grown since the previous year, its attendance was still about half that of Origins, reported in The Dragon around 1,300 paid attendance. While gamers from around the country would again come to Gen Con, even more notably, Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson from Games Workshop traveled from London to attend and wrote about their experience in issue 18 of Owl and Weasel. Their write up about Gen Con 9 interestingly mentioned the popularity of several other games and companies outside of TSR and D&D at Gen Con, writing that fantasy was featured strongly, with games of D&D, Lankmar, War of Wizards, and Petal Throne being played everywhere. Undoubtedly, the most popular non-fantasy game being played was Kingmaker, and significantly, the stall-selling Avalon Hill games sold out before they sold out of the new Starship Trooper game. There were, in fact, about 20 stalls, and it was more than interesting to meet the faces behind GDW, Flying Buffalo, SPI, etc. The guest of honor for Gen Con, however, would be the author Fritz Leiber, who would attend the convention primarily to promote his new board game Lankmar, designed by Harry Fisher and Leiber. Rob Kuntz would run a Lankmar tournament at Gen Con that year. Reception for the Lankmar game was generally positive, with Stuart Levin calling it a good game in Alarms and Excursions, and the Games Workshop providing a favorable review in Owl and Weasel, noting it is more of a war game than a fantasy game. On Friday afternoon, Lieber gave a seminar on sword and sorcery, followed by a pitch for his game. When Gygax introduced Lieber, he noted that Lieber has created some excellent sword and sorcery, which I admit to lifting a few ideas from when we did D&D. When asked, Lieber had to admit to the audience that he had not played D&D, and only just had the opportunity to review the rule booklet. Lankmar would not be the only new product unveiled at Gen Con 9, as the newly formed company, Judges Guild, would also reveal their first product, an urban adventure setting called City State of the Invincible Overlord, with a notice on its cover that it was endorsed by Dave Arneson, famous fantasy game author. 1 month prior, Bob Bloodsaw and Bill Owen arranged a meeting with TSR to introduce a new set of miniature rules set in the American Civil War. TSR at this point was still interested in publishing traditional rules for miniature war games, as evidenced by their Little Wars magazine. However, Bloodsaw and Owen would use this as an opportunity to secretly show off material from Bloodsaw's Dungeons & Dragons campaign to Arneson, McGarry, Kask, and Rob Kuntz. Upon seeing all this material, somewhat surprisingly, the good folks at TSR gave us much encouragement, spurring Bloodsaw and Owen to prepare City State of the Invincible Overlord for a Gen Con release. TSR would offer the Judges Guild an official, royalty-free license for its products, as they didn't see much profit in gaming supplements, and this would open up an opportunity for other third-party companies to develop products with TSR support. The founders of the Judges Guild would extend a personal thanks to Dave McGarry, Tim Kask, Dave Arneson, and Rob Kuntz, and the TSR Legions for the encouragement and +1 blessing given to the founding of Judges Guild. Notably, Gygax's name was missing from this acknowledgement. The D&D tournament at Gen Con this year would be hosted by Bob Blake, who first announced his plans for the tournament in the final issue of the Strategic Review in April. Blake ran parties of 5 players each through the dungeon, with about 20 trips in total. Interestingly, in the 3rd issue of Dragon magazine, he offered to sell copies of the tournament dungeon. Anyone wishing a copy of the tournament run at Gen Con 9 may write to me. The preliminary round and the final round are $2.50 each. A copy of both is $5. You'll get everything you need to spring this on your own D&D group. Gygax was eager to host Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson from Games Workshop at Gen Con 9, as they were key contributors to helping D&D grow overseas, and at this point, TSR would need to carefully choose industry allies to help with growing the company going forward. The day after Gen Con, TSR entered into a 3-year exclusive licensing agreement with Miniature Figurines, the New York branch of the British manufacturer of minifigs. This would give minifigs the right to produce Dungeons & Dragons licensed miniature figures in return for a 2.5% royalty, retroactive to June 1st. This would create a massive division between TSR and companies such as Heritage Models, as now TSR stood to gain more from the sale of one company over the other, and this would lead to questions surrounding bias in advertising within the pages of the Dragon. Overnight, Heritage went from one of TSR's biggest supporters to a rival, and this would accumulate in lawsuits to come. While the formation of the Judges Guild proved a path that third-party companies could take to produce Dungeons & Dragons material for TSR, some designers chose to create and sell products outside of TSR and without their blessing, such is the case with the manual Arania. By 1976, the players in the Arania campaign at Arrow Hobbies in Santa Monica had written enough variant material for their game to publish in a small booklet, which they did, and called it the Manual of Arania. However, instead of publishing it and promoting it through TSR like Judges Guild, they would advertise in the pages of APA-L and Alarms and Excursions. So why not work with TSR and promote it through the Dragon, with its larger audience and likely generate a greater profit? They were cautious approaching TSR with new ideas for D&D, as the last time they had when pitching the Thief class to Gygax, they received no credit or compensation from being published in the Greyhawk supplement. The introduction to the manual makes a reference to this, while not outright mentioning the Thief class, but saying that they came up with many types of new monsters, character types, and treasures, and that several were outright stolen and soon appeared in published form. So, printing the manual would help prevent this from happening again. As for TSR, it is likely they never realized the manual was published, but even if they did, it was careful to avoid using the trademark Dungeons and Dragons within its pages or advertisements, to prevent any cease and desist or other legal threat from TSR. While some third-party creators believed it was legally safe to print supplemental material for Dungeons and Dragons while avoiding the title and trademark, growing concern about the ambiguity of the legal copyright to Dungeons and Dragons began to mount and cause trepidation within the fan community. In issue 14 of Alarms and Excursions, Lee Gold published the following warning. In future issues, A&E will not publish/include any material rehashing characters, spells, monsters written up and copyrighted by TSR or anyone else. As an example, she points to the contribution from Lee Brewasser that almost verbatim reprinted the rules for the Ranger class that had been published in the Strategic Review. Gygax would respond to this policy in the next issue by writing, "With regard to the commercial sale of material pertaining to D&D, I can state that TSR is absolutely opposed to the practice in those cases where there is infringement on our copyright. Please let us take a look at the material if you wish to go ahead." However, what exactly Gygax and TSR meant by where there is infringement on our copyright was up to anyone's interpretation. How much of a given system, rule, spell, monster, or class would need to be changed to avoid infringement? To what degree? As Gygax wrote, publishers could send their material to TSR first to review, but given what happened with the Thief class, what third-party publisher would risk sending their new ideas to TSR first and having those ideas stolen? One safe way for third-party publishers to avoid infringement upon TSR's copyright would be to publish new aspects of gameplay. Not classes, monsters, or spells, but dungeon design. Outside of the Temple of the Frog from Blackmore, TSR had not begun publishing modules or dungeon designs yet. So in June 1976, Cask would give TSR's blessing to a new fanzine called The Dungeoneer that would publish not only articles about Dungeons and Dragons, but notably, dungeons designed by Janelle Jakeway. The dungeon in the first issue was an 11-room design called Fachelrak's Tomb. Not only would it provide a map with a key, similar to the wizard's tomb in the character Archaic, but it would also populate the key with monsters and treasures, similar to the Temple of the Frog, rather than leaving a blank worksheet. Each issue of the Dungeoneer would contain a new labyrinth, and while some would be designed by people other than Jakeway, her fundamental dungeon design theory would go on to inspire dungeons in D&D for years to come, being known as the Jakeway. The same month that the Dungeoneer was first published, TSR would also release Palace of the Vampire Queen, a third-party supplement written by Pete and Judy Kirsten, who had previously written the character Archaic. The Palace of the Vampire Queen is similar to the Wizard's Tomb from the character Archaic, with 5 levels of maps, and a map of each level for both the players and the Dungeon Master. The idea of giving players a map to follow was innovative, optionally done to help speed up gameplay, as a large aspect of D&D gameplay involved a mapper keeping track of the referee's verbal description of the dungeon. Unlike Jakeway's dungeon in the Dungeoneer, the key to these levels does not go into great detail explaining the contents of each room, instead providing a piece of background text for the players and encouraging Dungeon Masters to use their imagination for dialogue or any extra details. To this point, TSR believed that there'd be no market for pre-written dungeons, as each Dungeon Master would want to design their own. While TSR would not officially start writing and publishing modules for D&D in 1976, the success of the Dungeoneer, Palace of the Vampire Queen, and even Bob Lake selling his dungeon design from this year's Gen Con would signal to TSR that there was a market and desire for pre-published dungeons and modules, and it would not take long for TSR to eventually enter into this market themselves. TSR would release another supplement for D&D in the summer of 1976, advertised in the August issue of The Dragon as the last D&D supplement, called Gods, Demi-Gods and Heroes, written by Rob Kuntz and Jim Ward, an English and history teacher who offered to help because of his knowledge about mythology. The supplement had first been hinted to as far back as December 1975, with Tim Kask writing in the Strategic Review that, sometime before Gen Con, we were also going to publish Gods, Demi-Gods and Heroes. This seemed like a natural supplement to release, as the original game had no gods that a cleric might worship, and sure enough, The supplement would be published just after Gen Con. Unlike the previous supplements of Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Eldritch Wizardry, this supplement does not provide any new classes, spells, or magic items, and is simply a list of deities from real-world cultures, both historical and contemporary, as well as some fictional pantheons such as Robert E. Howard's Hyboria and the Melnibonian mythos from Michael Moorcock's Elric. The cover was another full-color illustration, this time done by Sutherland, although most of the interior artwork are public domain prints used for page ornamentation. In the years since its release, the supplement has drawn criticism for being culturally insensitive and encouraging dungeon masters to include real-world deities, some still worshipped by people today, into their campaigns for players to kill. While I can't personally speak on the cultural insensitivity point, I do want to explore the second criticism. It is pretty common knowledge among gamers today that if you give a creature a stat block, players will find a way to kill it. However, from reading the foreword, it was never the intention for player characters to kill deities, and in fact, it is the opposite that is heavily implied. As Tim Kask writes, this volume is something else. Our last attempt to reach the Monty Hall DMs. Perhaps now some of the giveaway campaigns will look as foolish as they truly are. This is our last attempt to delineate the absurdity of 40+ level characters. When Odin the Allfather has only 300 hit points, who can take a 44th level lord seriously? Kask's statement further supports Gygax's article in the Strategic Review, writing that no player in either Blackmoor or Greyhawk has risen above the 14th level, and that the Caltech players were playing their own game that is not D&D. The Alarms and Excursions community would respond to this messaging in turn. Nick Smith, one of the Caltech players, noted in his review, Gygax apparently wasn't kidding in his article in The Dragon, where he deplored the fact that D&D characters had actually reached, gasp, as high as 20th level. However, Smith criticizes Gygax himself for this phenomenon, as the original D&D rules provide a system whereby characters can advance indefinitely, and Greyhawk does its best to make it easy. Instead of doing something to limit character levels, Gygax's group has said, haha, we said the gods are low level, and you can't be better than a god, now can you? Steve McIntosh acknowledged this as well, writing, Odin only has 275 hit points, and some of the heroes are pretty puny compared to some of the characters running around in A&E expedition reports. Stuart Levin wrote about how he had a chance to read through a copy of Gen Con, and that it was terrible. Conan only has a 17 constitution, and was a 15th level fighting man thief, while his god Crom was only 20th level. Yuck. However, Glenn Blackhow would somewhat defend Gygax's position in A&E, writing that the issue was more about the Monty Hall Dungeon Masters than characters of too high level, saying, the problem with gods, demigods, and such like trash is not that the gods are portrayed as just 20th level fighters, most aren't, but that a lot of games are so magic rich that your ultra level characters are so well equipped that they will outclass the gods in special abilities. Outside of Alarms and Excursions, reaction to Gods, Demi-Gods, and Heroes was a bit more positive. In issue 9 of Space Gamer, Glenn Taylor writes a review praising it, saying, I'm no scholar of ancient and modern legends, but it seems to me the authors have given a view of the various mythological concepts, which is both panoramic and scrupulously detailed, and as complete as possible within the space limitations. For students of ancient legends, it's a Type 1 treasure. He also describes the stat blocks themselves as superb. Gods are presented with the number of hit points, armor class, move, psionic abilities, etc. in tabular form. His only criticism seems to be mainly on how this material could be properly introduced into a campaign, noting, when you try to actually use it in a D&D campaign, well, I don't know. It seems that something should have been said about how this material was intended to be used, or how the authors used it in their campaigns. I doubt if more than a few referees will feel entirely comfortable with actually using them. TSR would release another, less controversial supplement for Dungeons & Dragons in the summer, called Swords and Spells. Practically speaking, Gods, Demi-Gods, and Heroes is considered the last supplement for the game of Dungeons & Dragons, as Swords and Spells was a replacement for the Fantasy supplement in Chainmail, and doesn't provide any system updates or additions to the game Dungeons & Dragons. As Kask writes in the foreword, these rules are the grandson of Chainmail. The main change introduced in Swords and Spells is the mixed figure scale. So for example, a 5th level fighting man would deal half as much damage as a 10th level fighting man. Swords and Spells also introduces other aspects of D&D, such as level, armor class, and the spells for magic users and clerics. The reception of Swords and Spells was mainly positive. In Space Gamer, Robert Taylor praises it as a very elaborate and expanded updating of the Chainmail rules. Swords and Spells is extremely well done. The layout is excellent, the artwork is good and appropriate, and the rules are superb. They are written in a clear, easy style that allows for quick assimilation. In Alarms and Excursions, Charlie Lucy called it the best thing to come out of TSR since Greyhawk. As the release of Gods, Demi-Gods, and Heroes continued to raise criticisms regarding TSR asserting its creative control over what is considered D&D, Gygax would respond to the many criticisms directed towards himself and TSR in a letter published in Alarms and Excursions 15. In this 3-page letter, he directly responds to criticisms from Rich Schwall, Lee Gold, Glenn Blackow, Dan Pearson, Charlie Lucy, Wayne Shaw, and Sam Conkin that generally relate to how he runs dungeon exploration and combat. And the most pointed criticism comes at the end of the letter when he directly calls out Caltech players and their criticisms towards Gods, Demi-Gods, and Heroes. Gygax writes, "It seems that Dungeons and Beavers players are getting paranoid. We did not design gods simply to shame them or whatever. The supplement was written to conform to the major types of play going on in the country." The subliminal messaging with how the letter is constructed is hard to miss here. After defending how his group plays D&D, he equates that with the major type of play going on in the country, further cementing his authorial stance over what he considers to be the real D&D. While he concedes that if the beings therein do not fit into their particular manner of play, it is easy enough to ignore the whole work, or add a 0 to the hit points each can take, he seems to call back to his previous article in the Strategic Review, where he wrote, "Different strokes for different folks, but that is not D&D." Of course, Gygax's letter would elicit further responses and reactions in the next issue of Alarms and Excursions. In issue 16, Stuart Levin would respond with, "I found that you made several disparaging remarks about some of the rather well-known A&E contributors as to their method of play. You, sir, seem to think that everyone can play your style of D&D. Well, luckily for the D&D game, everyone has a different kind of playing, for as you said in your first books, that those rules were supposed to be as guidelines, not restricting bonds. You have given the world a great game that has no end in sight of dying out. You have done well. So why try to reform everybody to your kind of playing?" Steve McIntosh somewhat strangely starts his response by apologizing for his criticisms of Gygax's writing abilities, before going into several paragraphs about how chainmail and D&D are so poorly written they can only be understood by seasoned wargamers, and even in their case, Lee Gold had to explain several key concepts to them so they could know how to play the game properly. He would end his letter by writing, "TSR has a tremendous amount of power, whether you wish it or not, over a large percentage of the D&D playing populace, and that anything that you say or publish becomes gospel. I myself feel that this is due mainly because of the confusing experience by most new players in trying to decipher the rules as written. It would not take long for these concerns to rear up again, and with the final supplement of Dungeons & Dragons printed, the debate would take place over the pages of the Dragon. Although the Dragon was not a TSR House organ, and was technically independent from TSR, in its early days, many readers would just see it as an extension of Gygax and TSR, with the systems published within its pages deemed gospel for D&D, and how Gygax personally intended for the game to be played. This perception was bolstered by Gygax's earlier letters and articles authoritatively deeming what is and is not D&D, and when issue 3 of the Dragon would publish a set of rules for female characters in D&D, the debating would rage on. In his diplomacy zine, Liaisons Dangerous 72, Len Lakofka published an article called Women and Magic, with a new system for female characters in D&D. These rules would be republished in issue 3 of the Dragon under the article Notes on Women and Magic, bringing the distaff gamer into D&D. And the blatant sexism in the system seemed to reinforce suspicion in the community that D&D was meant specifically to target the male audience, bolstered by Gygax's previous writings and comments, such as in Europa when he wrote, among other things, that women can stay away from wargaming in droves for all I care. I've seen many a good wargame and wargamer spoiled thanks to the fair sex. So what exactly were these rules for female characters? Women would have their charisma score replaced with a beauty score, and as fighters are clearly behind men in all cases, with a specifically determined strength score between 2 and 14 instead of 3 and 18. Beautiful thieves are capable of the spells of seduction and charm men, and fighting women may incorporate spells of seduction, charm men, or charm humanoid monster, depending on their level and beauty scores. There's an entire table dedicated to saving throws against female seduction. However, neutral and lawful clerics are never permitted to use their female charms. For those magic users with a low beauty score between 2 and 5, they would be considered grotesque witches and can scare victims of 3 hit die or fewer to death. The community reaction to the Dragon publishing these rules was intense. In Alarms and Excursions 19, following an image of female adventurers hanging an effigy of Lakofka, Kask, and Gygax, Samuel Conkin writes, I have 2 complaints to Gygax, Kask, and Len Lukofka. First, women were portrayed in illustrations right from book 1 as character types. Obviously, it was going to be assumed that they arose from the same dice rolls and the same categories as males. My second complaint is that not only are the changes no improvement, they cause an unnecessary constriction of possibilities and deliberately inject sexist assumptions where none were before. Beauty is substituted for charisma. Thus, in one stroke, female characters are eliminated from leadership. How, for example, could a paladin woman come about now? The Lukofka system constricts possibilities in D&D rather than expanding them. He does provide a small pass to Gygax, noting that it is possible that Gary Gygax knows nothing of the article, however, that he should take greater care in monitoring what appears in an imprimatur so closely associated with him. While these rules may not have been written by Gygax or published in an official supplement, the underlying feeling was that any system published in the Dragon came with TSR's stamp of authorial intent, a feeling not helped by Gygax's earlier declarations on what is and is not D&D. Kask would respond to these criticisms with a letter in the next issue of Alarms and Excursions, looking to set straight some of the assumptions in Konkin's letter. He starts by trying to refute the presumed authorial intent and canonicity of the Dragon, writing that it is not a Gary Gygax magazine, nor does it carry any imprimatur. The Dragon has never said anything to lead to this conclusion. The Dragon is not a monthly supplement. Where in the magazine does it say that you are bound to the items presented? However, he seems to contradict this a bit later on in the letter, asking, why have you chosen this method of showing your disapproval? Why didn't you write to the magazine so that I could use it on the letters page and initiate a dialogue on the topic? So on the one hand, Kask is saying that the Dragon does not control what is and is not D&D, but on the other hand, it should have control over the conversation and debate regarding it. Kask seems to assume full responsibility for printing the article and welcomes all criticisms of it towards him, while even agreeing that it is sexist and puts women down, and that it makes them physically weaker. While Kask admits that he thinks the system is sexist, he doesn't provide an explanation as to why he decided to print it in the Dragon regardless. He would speak to this later on in his YouTube channel when asked about issue 3 of the Dragon, both in regards to this article and the idiot class.
And it wasn't meant to be sexist. You have to think of the context of 1976. In that context of 1976, yes, we were trying to get females interested in the game. The game was not even a full 2 years old. The game had been born with a bunch of guys from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois getting together in those various 3 locations and playing war games. There were guys. I never, ever saw a woman playing a war game. RPGs came out of wargaming. Whether it was boards or minis, it was wargaming. I played the game. I took it back to my college club, which was all guys. It wasn't because we didn't try to talk to girls. So this article, Women in Gaming, was a sincere attempt to make playing D&D more attractive to females. It's so easy to go back and look at behavior just as short as 40 years ago and go, oh, how horrible, without taking into account the evolution and progress we hope we've made in those 40 years. But it was a legitimate attempt to interest ladies. But we were trying to push the limits of gaming to get women interested.
If Kask's intention was to try and increase the appeal of D&D towards women, it likely had the opposite effect. As Bruce Saul wrote, the Lukofka system drives women away from the game, besides being intrinsically illogical and sexist orientated. Kay Jones would also support this perspective, writing that the major fault of the system is rather that of substituting beauty for charisma. In the Lukofka system, a woman may seduce a man, but may never lead him, something which I'm sure would have startled Joan of Arc, Queen Elizabeth, or Catherine of Russia, to name a few. As for the issue of canonicity, Jay Quay would respond to Cass by writing, "You are right in saying that the magazine you published should not be considered a monthly supplement. The problem is you are, repeat, are TSR Hobbies, publishers of D&D. The fact that you publish the variations that you do means that you've condoned them for usage. An editor is responsible for what he publishes. Be responsible for what you print." The growing divide between the gaming community and TSR throughout 1976 was mirrored by internal factionalism and division within the company itself. As mentioned earlier, the growth of TSR involved hiring new employees, with Arneson, McGarry, Carr, and Sutherland from Minnesota, and Gygax, Bloom, and the Kuntz brothers from Lake Geneva, along with Tim Kask from Illinois. These 9 employees were working closely together in the new house they converted into TSR's offices, and things were initially very optimistic. Dave McGarry described it as a Camelot of sorts, with working relations peaking around Gen Con of 1976.
I think that the best time that we had there as a group where everything was cooking was the Gen Con at the Horticultural Hall. You know, everything, it was a really successful convention. Everybody was working together. We were getting the production out, you know, we released products. We had Fritz Leiber there, you know. It was an amazingly fun time. It looked like the future was going to go, you know, perfectly, and then things started going sour there.
However, deep-rooted resentments from early on between Arneson's Minnesota group and Gygax's Lake Geneva group would slowly fester over the course of the year, culminating in a November shareholder meeting that would become an existential crisis for both TSR and everyone involved in the company. Tensions between Dave Arneson and Brian Bloom started before Arneson had even joined TSR, which we looked at in the last video, with the tense negotiations between Arneson and Bloom over the terms of his employment contract. In these negotiations, Arneson consistently demanded a higher salary, more benefits, and guaranteed growth opportunities within the company, with things getting so tense between himself and Bloom that had Gygax not stepped in, Arneson may have never joined TSR in the first place. At the same time as these negotiations were going on, Tim Kask was in charge of editing Arneson's Blackmore supplement from the disparate collection of notes that Arneson had submitted to TSR. With the state of the submitted draft manuscript being such a disaster, it was a huge job for Kask to edit it and rewrite most of it into a publishable product, and this infuriated Kask. And now, throughout 1976, Kask also needs to edit 2 more of Arneson's disastrous manuscripts for the games Ships of the Line and Naval Orders of Battle, furthering this resentment between Kask and Arneson. Although Kask was from Illinois and not Lake Geneva, he was the first hire to TSR, and as a result had a very close relationship and loyalty to Gygax. Kask would go out of his way to protect Gygax, an example we saw earlier when Kask wrote in Alarms and Excursions to take all of the criticism and blame for the article on women in D&D printed in The Dragon, writing that The Dragon is not a Gary Gygax magazine. I have been sole editor and am therefore the correct target for your slings and arrows. Arneson resented this closeness between Kask and Gygax, furthering the division between the two of them, and Arneson would push back at Kask. One example of this is the story of the donuts. Arneson would go through every publication of the Dragon magazine and put circles, or donuts, around all of the typos and errors that he found. He would make comments and jokes at Kask's expense regarding these donuts, but Kask didn't know or understand the meaning of any of it. One day in late 1976, Arneson came to Kask's desk and dropped a box of donuts on it. Dave Sutherland explained the meaning of it to Kask, and he was incensed. Writing about the incident years later, Kask said that Arneson had the unmitigated effrontery to present me with a box of cheap donuts, in recognition of the latest issue of The Dragon. With how small the house was, these tensions were impossible to ignore, and would take on a physical division between those upstairs and those downstairs. At one point, with the continued growth of D&D sales, a bunch of orders came in at the same time, and everyone in the company had to pause their regular roles and pack boxes and shipping to fulfill the orders. During this time, it was found out that Arneson was extremely fast and efficient at packaging and labeling boxes and shipping. So from that point forward, Arneson was directed to work more in the basement, packing, labeling, and shipping boxes. This would create a symbolic divide between Gygax upstairs and Arneson downstairs. And as D&D continued to grow and more orders continued to flood in, there's an ever-increasing need of Arneson in the shipping department. Arguably, had Arneson not been keeping up with shipping out the increasing orders throughout 1976, TSR may have completely failed, as the money would stop coming in. But on top of the increased role in shipping, Arneson was expected to keep up his other roles of bringing in new talent, games, and game design of his own. It would prove to be too much and too exhausting for him, as illustrated in one of Dave Sutherland's Dave McGarry comic strips, showing an overwhelmed Dave Arneson in the shipping department. Arneson uprooted his life and moved from his home in Minnesota to come and design games. And now he's packing boxes and being criticized for not writing games or bringing in new talent. Tension would also grow between Dave McGarry and Gygax. TSR printed McGarry's Dungeon board game and would hire McGarry to take on the role of treasurer and look after TSR's books. While McGarry had no formal training, he did work in the copy center at the Harvard Law School and read everything that came through. One of these things that he read was a paper on the stages that all new companies go through. At each stage, the company would encounter a crisis. However, any company that could overcome these crises would come out stronger on the other side, and McGarry believed that TSR could be one of these companies. However, whenever he tried to warn Gygax that they needed to prepare for this, Gygax wouldn't listen. He would just say that these things wouldn't happen to TSR. One night, over dinner at the Gygax house with Gary and Mary Jo, McGarry would bring this paper up again, and they would take great offense at it.
I had the 5 stages in mind, and I sort of said I was looking forward to the day when we were so big that people would forget, who Gary Gygax was. I was thinking of IBM, I was thinking of AT&T, these very large companies that after a while you don't know who was the beginnings of those things. Well, they were insulted when it was nothing but the highest praise in my mind was that we would become so fabulously wealthy and fabulously large, as a company, that we would sort of drift, away from that point on, which I never understood until much, much later, that's how they interpreted that statement. And ultimately that led to the fallout that Gary and I had.
Although they were from Lake Geneva and close to Gygax, resentment would also grow between the Kuntz brothers and Gygax. Like Arneson, Rob and Terry Kuntz both want to work in game design. Rob co-wrote the supplements of Greyhawk and Gods, Demi-Gods and Heroes, published his first short story, The Quest for the Vermilion Volume, and wanted to work on writing a supplement based on his world of Celebrine. However, Gygax had him packing boxes in the shipping department. Terry wrote a short story used to create the Beholder monster that figured prominently on the cover of the Greyhawk supplement, and he has a Robin Hood role-playing game that he wants to design. But Gygax has him working in the dungeon hobby shop instead. On top of being forced to work in these departments, they were also being paid the least, with Terry being paid through a federal program for small businesses, not by TSR directly. All of the tension and factionalism would boil over and explode during the annual TSR shareholder meeting held November 3rd, 1976. During the weeks leading up to the meeting, Arneson would coordinate with McGarry and Carr to vote together as a block to try and expand TSR's board of directors from just Gygax and Bloom, adding 2 more directors. As it stood, with Gygax and Bloom being the only 2 directors, whatever they said goes. However, Gygax and Bloom at this time also controlled 1,500 of the 1,807 shares of TSR, so could easily vote down this motion. So McGarry's plan was to suggest Melvin Bloom, Brian Bloom's father, as candidates to fill one of these board positions. Melvin has the most money invested in TSR, is business-minded, and although he assigns his proxy votes to Brian, the idea is that the suggestion would encourage Brian to vote with the Minnesota Bloc and against Gygax to get the motion put through and expand the board. Ideally, this could lead to TSR eventually being moved from Lake Geneva to Minneapolis, which would make business sense as it is a large city and center of commerce. And for the Minnesota gamers, this would mean being able to move back home, especially important for Arneson, who never felt at home or enjoyed living in Lake Geneva. But to Gygax, this is a direct threat and an attack on his control over the company, a company that he has been running with a sort of authoritarianism and paternalism. The shareholder meeting was tense. After McGarry delivered the treasurer's report and Gygax spoke on areas of expansion, the confrontation started. A motion was put forward, although the minutes do not say by whom, to expand the board of directors from 2 to 4. 289 votes were cast in support of the motion, representing the holdings of the Twin Cities group, Arneson, McGarry, Carr, and Sutherland. As for Brian Bloom, whatever plan was in place to get him on their side backfired, and he voted with Gygax, shutting down the motion. It is unclear how confident the Twin Cities group was that Bloom would vote with them, but Bloom voting against them and with Gary Gygax cemented both his loyalty towards Gygax and indispensable value in helping Gygax retain power over what would be seen to him at the time as a group of traitors trying to usurp his power from his own company. As his daughter Elise would say later on,
"My father ruled with an iron fist. If you don't like it, too bad." And, it was his way, and that was it. And he, Dad suffered from a very bad temper.
but it's not the Gygax family that he's ruling over. It's the TSR family. Later on in the meeting, Rob would suggest an improvement that TSR could make to the shipping department, and Gygax yelled and screamed at Rob in response, seeing even a small and harmless suggestion as a threat to his power. To Gary, it's like his children have betrayed him, with Rob especially being in a unique position as someone basically raised by Gygax since he was a child. In a way to tighten his grip and control over the company, and this perceived mutiny over the company, Gygax would release a memo the next day outlining our official policy regarding the following areas of professional activity, covering consulting, game design analysis, and research with other companies. TSR employees would not be allowed to work with other companies, and while this is standard practice for most companies, the timing of its release seemed to specifically target Arneson. There were suspicions by this point that Arneson, who started primarily working from his home, was spending time working for other competing companies that had established themselves throughout 1976, such as the Judges Guild. After this memo was released, Rob Kuntz would resign from TSR, with Gygax exploding at him during the shareholder meeting, being told he had to stay in shipping instead of doing creative work, and now a memo being released further limiting his ability to pursue creative efforts outside of TSR. It was just too much for him. Dave McGarry would also leave TSR around this time, although I have found conflicting reports on when this happened. In Game Wizards, John Peterson writes that Arneson reported that McGarry resigned the day after the shareholder meeting. However, in the When We Were Wizards podcast, they say he actually resigned from TSR before the shareholder meeting. In any event, the story and reasoning why is the same, a misunderstanding between Gygax and McGarry. The Australian distributor for his Dungeon board game said they were shipping it incorrectly, and Gygax told McGarry to take care of it. By this, McGarry thought he meant to do something illegal, and given the previous tension between them, found this to be the tipping point and quit TSR. Rob's brother, Terry Kuntz, would also quit shortly after, at the start of 1977, for many of the same reasons as Rob. Tired of his position running the Dungeon hobby shop, and with no direct path towards game design, it became too much. Neil Topolnicki would also leave TSR at the start of 1977. However, Mike Carr would stay on, now as the vice president, and Dave Sutherland would also stay. As the only staff artist, Sutherland was indispensable to TSR and would actually receive a raise. Tim Kask, loyal to Gygax, would also stay. Just 4 days after the shareholder meeting, Gygax would announce a new employee handbook and time clock for hourly employees. The section in the handbook on attendance said that employees are required to be on duty during their work hours and must not leave the company premises except on approved company business without permission of their immediate supervisor, a policy that seemed to directly target Arneson, as he frequently worked from home by this point. To add to this outrage and feeling of being targeted, Tim Kask was excused from using the punch clock. Along with the new company handbook, Gygax also sent Arneson a written statement of ownership of games produced during employment by TSR. This would revise the employment agreement, retroactive to the beginning of the year, requiring that each and every game, set of game rules or game-related concept and or portion thereof, which I originate, create, develop, prepare, edit, write, playtest, and or cause to or aid to be published during the term of my employment by TSR Hobbies Inc., is the sole and exclusive property of TSR Hobbies Inc., and would still apply after Arneson left TSR. Agreements like this are pretty standard for companies to have, but the timing of it is notable, and Arneson would feel directly targeted by this. Arneson requested time to consult legal counsel before signing the agreement, so Gygax sent him a letter granting the extension, noting that, as signing the statement is a condition of employment, failure to do so will be considered a resignation of employment, effective on the deadline for signature, 15 November 1976. Effectively, he would have a week to sign it. Arneson drove back to the Twin Cities to consult with his uncle, who urged him not to sign it. Instead, they formulated a counterproposal to that would allow him the rights to the games that he designed and give TSR a right of first refusal to publish his work. Arneson would return to TSR 1 day late, on Tuesday, November 16th, to drop off his counterproposal. When he picked up his check, he saw that $40 had been deducted from his pay for taking the trip back to the Twin Cities, as it was an unauthorized trip, which incensed Arneson as he had taken the trip with his direct supervisors, Bloom and Carr. Arneson typed a letter to Gygax, writing, "Unless the management of TSR is willing to negotiate the terms of the agreement, I must assume that TSR has terminated my employment, as I cannot, in good conscience, sign the agreement as it now stands," adding to the letter that Mike Carr had approved my leave as a paid absence. He then packed up his things and left the office. Gygax would write a letter back to Arneson, rejecting his counterproposal. Those employees of TSR who are doing creative work are doing so strictly for the benefit of TSR with regard to their designs. As you do not wish to sign the statement, we cannot have you continue as research director. Henceforward, you are transferred to shipping. Your hourly rate will be $2.30 per hour with a basic 40-hour week. Please note that we are transferring you despite the fact that you committed an intolerable offense by leaving the premise today without the courtesy to notify anyone. On the supposedly unauthorized trip, Gygax wrote, Mr. Carr informs me that he did not, in fact, state that you would be paid for the 2 days you were absent, finishing the letter by saying, we must suspend your employment for 10 days without pay. On November 20th, 2.5 weeks after the shareholder meeting, Arneson sent a letter to Gygax telling him to send all of his royalty checks to his parents' address in St. Paul. And with that, Arneson left TSR. Despondently, Arneson would write to the Snyder brothers, I have no future plans, as I am basically unemployable. I will certainly try and continue writing, but it's unlikely that I will find a publisher anywhere. Hopefully they will still pay my D&D royalties so I can live. That hope would become the basis of a $1 million lawsuit in just a couple of years. After a few days and settling back in with his parents, Arneson's spirits would return and he started thinking towards the future. He wrote to John Snyder, I will be starting a company here in Minnesota to publish and market rulebooks, with an editor, Mike Carr, artist, Dave Sutherland, research editor, me, and an accountant, Dave McGarry. Carr and Sutherland were still TSR employees, but Arneson reasoned it wouldn't be long until they left TSR due to Gygax's authoritarian control. The name of this company would be Adventures Unlimited, after a travel agency that he had once planned on opening. By the end of 1976, TSR was selling over 1,000 copies of D&D each month, a sales trend that would be comfortably sustained over the next year. It was clear by this point that D&D was no wargame, and that TSR was officially charting new waters in the role-playing game industry. The growing consumer base that bought the game would add to the growing community of dedicated fans, writing in zines, playing at conventions, and wanting to contribute to the game and take its innovative gameplay in new directions, both with and without TSR's blessings. And if TSR was going to continue being successful stewards of D&D and faces of the role-playing game industry, Gygax would need to learn and grow from the challenges that TSR faced throughout 1976, both internally as a company and externally with the D&D community. One example we can see that truly demonstrates the growth and popularity of Dungeons & Dragons throughout 1976 is its appearance in a more mainstream format, that being articles in newspapers about the game. An article in the August 9th issue of the Washington Post titled War Games, Tolkien, and the Fantastic Conflict Between the Duke and the Evil Balrog Masked by His Phantasm gives insight into a campaign, describing it as the players choose a Tolkienic character at the beginning of the game and become that character for the duration of the adventure, with the Dungeon Master asking, what do you do? The article notes several distinctions between it and traditional wargames, with one notable aspect being the large amount of women playing, 5 of the 13 players being women. However, the article mistakenly believes that the game was published by Avalon Hill, likely a confusion compounded by the article referring to D&D as a wargame and not a role-playing game. Similarly, the August 17th article, Fazil Battles Orcs with Giant Beetle Carcasses, printed in the Detroit Free Press, follows the Rith campaign that had been going on for several years by the Metro Detroit gamers. Mike Bartnowski and Paul Wood are featured prominently in the article, which also focuses on the differences that Dungeons & Dragons has from traditional wargames, and also doesn't use the term role-playing game, but instead fantasy gaming. As the article summarizes, essentially what you get is a rulebook, and the players wing it from there, modifying the rules and adapting as they go along. TSR would begin adopting the term role-playing games out of necessity, as by now it had so far decoupled itself from traditional miniature wargames that a new title was needed. But fantastic medieval wargame campaigns would also not be suitable for other games they had in production. For instance, Jim Ward's Metamorphosis Alpha, released in November of 1976, had the basic elements of D&D, but without the medieval fantasy element. And sure enough, the foreword by Gygax and Bloom refers to Metamorphosis Alpha as one of the new breed of role-playing games. But what exactly defined what a role-playing game actually meant? Tabletop role-playing games would exhibit a cluster of similar elements. A role for referees and players, where the referee establishes the situation and hidden elements of the world, and the players explore the situation and the world through a shared imagined reality. Players interact with the world through a dialogue with the referee, and outcomes are adjudicated through a set of defining qualities and elements of random chance. Anything can be attempted by the characters, with the referee tasked with determining the outcome of these attempts. By balancing the modes of combat and exploration, these high and low moments blend together to create a dramatic tension and excitement for the players. Over the course of several games, players in the world of the referee would grow, change, and adapt to the game itself. While other war games had some of these qualities, it was D&D that combined them together into a new form that would captivate a new community of gamers in an altogether new form of gaming. No matter what Gygax, Arneson, or anyone else would say after 1976, the invention of D&D and role-playing games was not the work of one person, but the result of years of collaboration and labor from a community of thousands of gamers over several years and all over the world. Whether it be the contributors to Alarms and Excursions or Dave Arneson himself, if that community could not work with TSR, they would work against it. Thank you so much for watching the 5th episode of my series on the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it, one book at a time. What do you think about the story of the publication of Eldritch Wizardry, Gods, Demi-Gods and Heroes, and Swords and Spells, and the community reaction to them? Did anything about the growth and factionalism of TSR throughout 1976 surprise you? Let me know in those comments down below. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the war waged between Arneson and Gygax throughout 1977, as Arneson seeks to compete with TSR and weaken their place within the tabletop role-playing game industry, as well as TSR's release of the Holmes Basic set. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Kevbot, and I will see you in the next video.